Welcome to Trek Speak, the Star Trek video podcast available on iTunes and also at trekspeak.com. Now, the Next Generation is celebrating its 25th anniversary, and I have to admit, I had to look up those dates. Was it really 25 years since the show started? It's hard to believe, but that is in fact the case, and now we're seeing lots of great tie-ins for the anniversary, lots of new products out, including the brand new Star Trek The Next Generation 365 book, which is the counterpart to the first book based on the original series. And I'm pleased to be joined by the authors now. We have indeed Paula and Terry Erdmann, who are on Video Skype Live. Hello to you both.
Hello. Glad to be here.
Absolutely fantastic to talk to you both. As I told you previously, I have so many of your titles on my bookshelf. I've been a huge collector of Star Trek books, whether it be fiction or reference, and I'm hoping to speak to you about many of those titles during the course of this interview. But of course, to start off and to just let people know initially about this new title, it's a wonderful format, a format that I just haven't seen before. You could almost call it coffee table, with lots of writing, lots of great facts, and so many rare photos. I've been absolutely blown away reading this. I suppose, what kind of a format is this? Has this been out before in other forms?
Yeah, Abrams has been doing this book, they've been doing a series of coffee table books called 365 for
many years.
I'm not sure how long, but
several decades.
Long enough that they've covered quite a bit of territory, and it runs the gamut. They pretty much do a book on whatever seems like it would be very cinema heavy. They've done books on, the New York City skyline. They've done books on the Beatles. They've done books on the Rolling Stones. They've done books on the punk scene, punk music scene.
Andy Warhol art. They've done books about jewelry and books about national parks and many different things.
Yeah, and I suspect what made them think that Star Trek would be a good subject is they've done a couple on Star Wars. Some behind-the-scenes books on Star Wars that were very popular, and they're really great. They have lots of photography in them, wonderful stuff that's never been seen. And I think they decided that it was time to do something like that with Star Trek, and so they came to us about the first book, which came out in 2010. They came to us the very end of 2008, but we didn't get started on it till 2009.
Right, I mean, I was so fascinated to see, as you mentioned, the rare photos and just things that I haven't ever seen before. I was just smiling there as I looked down at a page which had, it was 4 photos, 4 different takes of a Next Generation cast photo, and to see them, how they were smiling in one and in the other they're dead serious. I mean, this is the kind of thing that is just so rare and so great to see. I suppose, what was the process of picking the photos and narrowing them down to the point you were actually happy, this is what we're going to put in the book?
We worked out the process on the first book, on the original series. Paula actually sat down and phoned everybody she could think of, from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory to the photographers who shot for Reader's Digest magazine, for TV Guide magazine. We called everybody, just looking for things that maybe had never been published before.
Or that had been published like back in the original era, but not recently, so people weren't familiar with them.
Right, so we found photography that was either 40 years old or hadn't been seen, and of course we had to revert to some newer things. But so we had learned how to do it writing that first book. So on this book, we did the same thing. We called our friends. We asked them to open up boxes in their garage or go into closets or come up with their private scrapbooks, and they did it.
And in a way, the first book was really hard about the original series because you think, well, the show's been around for 45 years. Who hasn't seen everything? But we managed to scrape up a little bit that hadn't been seen. For this book, it was a different challenge because the Next Generation, I worked in the licensing department of Paramount while it was in production. And one of my jobs was to get photography to all of the publishing licensees, the people who were doing the Star Trek tie-in books and the magazines and the comic books. And it was my job to scrounge up a lot of photography for those people so they had illustrations or references for art. And I knew that so much of that stuff had been seen during that era that I was really worried we wouldn't be able to find anything fresh. But we were allowed to dig through studio archives, and we actually did find things. I'm surprised at how many people are saying they've never seen any of these shots, and these are people who are working on the show.
Right.
Yeah.
In the case of the one you mentioned with the 4 publicity shots of them standing on the transporter pad, that actually, you probably would have never seen that during the production of the show, because the ones that you didn't see were actually rejects. Those were ones the publicity department said, we're not using these, because they were goofing around on the transporter pad there. So, but at this point, nobody really cares. And the stuff was in a box, and they all looked good in the pictures, so we sent them to them for approval, and they were fine with it.
Certainly a treasure trove of photos there, and any fan of Next Generation, it will certainly evoke nostalgia for you. I think for me, the Next Generation being the sort of path into Star Trek, the show that I first watched, maybe picked it up around the 4th season, it's always retained a high level of nostalgia. And to see pictures of, for example, the Seeley from Lonely Among Us, those for me are just the real cult aliens from that early part of Next Generation. I suppose, talking about your own fandom, I suppose, when did you actually get into Star Trek yourself? What are your early memories of it? I suppose the question to both of you.
Well, Terry started out when he was young in rock and roll, so it took him a little while to get into Star Trek.
But I do have a story about it. Shall I tell my story?
Yes, tell your story, because mine's longer.
Okay. When the original series started, with Star Trek the original series, I was working in a rock and roll band, and we had a long-term gig in a nightclub, and every night we started playing on stage at, I believe it was 7:30 or 8 o'clock, I can't remember, but the drummer in the band would sit at the bar watching something on television, and then when we had to start playing on the half hour, we would get on stage, and he would keep looking across the bar at this picture that was now a long ways away, and he kept asking me, stand over to the side so I can see the TV screen. And after the 3rd or 4th week that this happened, I said, what are you watching? And he said, it's a new outer space show that's called Star Trek, and it's really good. Well, because we always had this nightclub gig, I never saw the first season of the show.
Right.
So the next year, I had the evenings off, and I started watching the 2nd series. But I was still working many nights, and I didn't get to see it. So I really didn't catch on to the show until it came out in reruns, and actually when the first movie came out. Paula, on the other hand.
Yeah, I was in high school. I'd always liked science fiction shows, so, it started showing when I was in high school. And I just started watching it, and I really liked it. The characters were really likable, and the stories were interesting, and some of them were creepy, and I liked all of that stuff. And, so it was on TV, and the show ended when I graduated from high school, and you would have thought that was that, but it immediately went into syndication. And as it turned out, when I went away to college, it got popular in reruns like that, and so I would be sitting in my dorm room with some little junky TV set watching it while people were going down to dinner. And I was always late to dinner because I was watching the rerun of Star Trek that was on at 5:30 or whatever it was. And while I was in college, I met some people who had formed a Star Trek club. And as geeky as it sounds, we got together and we started doing fanzines, and we went to conventions, and we did costumes and all of the stuff that you expect out of fandom. But it was, it was what they call the golden age of, the golden age of Star Trek fandom, where everybody was writing and being creative and just having a great time. The conventions were kind of pure. People hadn't done them before, and everybody had a great time. So that was my history in it. And it ended up giving me my job working at Paramount, because at the time they hired me, they were looking for someone who had a background in publishing, which by then I had, and who knew something about Star Trek.
Right.
Exactly. It's a dream job, I suppose, to have transitioned from being a fan into that sort of level where, you know, you were just responsible for so much more creative art that would come out in the years to come with the literature and the various books that you were associated with. You know, it's fascinating to me. I wonder, I mean, at that time, I suppose, again, to both of you, had you thought about writing? Had you thought about the movie industry as being a possible job for you at all?
Yes, I was actually in the movie industry when Paula and I met. I grew up in the Midwest in the United States, and I gone to Hollywood with a rock and roll band. And of course, that turned into a broken dream. So I applied for a job at a movie studio. I just went into the personnel office and took a typing test and got hired. And suddenly I was, you know, in the mix at the time. I was working for Columbia Pictures, but they had their offices on the Warner Brother Pictures movie lot. And as soon as I started seeing what was going on in those sound stages, I was hooked and forgot about the movie and the music industry. Suddenly I was working on a movie lot. And after a couple of years, I had a job as a senior publicist in the marketing department. A number of us had moved from where I was working over to the 20th Century Fox lot, and 20th Century Fox had the Star Wars movies. And so I was able to work on the publicity campaigns for both The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. And because of that, then some of my bosses moved over to Paramount Pictures, and because I had worked on those science fiction films, they asked me to come over there and work on the publicity job for the next Star Trek movie, which was Star Trek V. And so that was my very first film credit, was in the credits of Star Trek V. I'd been involved in the film business for a number of years, and that's exactly the same period when I met Paula.
Yeah, he met me a little bit before the Star Trek V experience. But in terms of my background, I'd always wanted to write. I loved to read, and I wanted, you know, my ambition when I was like 6 years old was to have my name on the spine of a book, because I knew that meant you were really important, but I just had to find some subject matter that I could talk about well. I had gotten into journalism out of college, and I began writing for a large publishing company on their news magazines, doing stories like that. And I met Terry when I was actually working on an industrial news magazine that wasn't very interesting, but it gave me a lot of writing experience and taught me how to write things fairly quickly and coherently. Eventually I moved to Los Angeles to be with Terry, because we'd started seeing each other and were dating cross country, because he was in Hollywood and I was in New York, and
they're a long way apart.
Yeah, right. They're about 1,000 miles apart. So, but and that time I was still writing professionally, and after I got the job at Paramount, I was so jealous of everybody. You know, I'm reading everybody's books, and I thought I could do this. You know, but I'd had stuff published professionally, but not any books, you know, magazine articles and that type of thing. And eventually, it was a bit of a conflict of interest for me to write those, since I was in charge of that program. So I couldn't really actively get involved till after I left the studio. I did participate in some books, but I didn't actually take any co-writing credits or direct credits on anything until after I left the studio, even though I worked on the books, but, you know, it just wouldn't have been kosher to take all the credit for the stuff. But Terry also had he had a writing background, because he had an English background, and he had been writing press kits for years.
An English major background.
Yes, yes, he wasn't English, but he was an English major, so he knew how to write, and he'd been doing, you know, very informative press kits for the studios for years.
Production notes and things on movies.
Yeah, so I mean, our first co-writing project were when one of the editors we were working with asked if we could start working on that book on Deep Space Nine.
Yes.
That you like. And we'd done some shorter pieces before that, but he really wanted a book on Deep Space Nine. And we didn't really realize it was going to take 8 years to write it.
It's certainly one of my absolute favorite reference books, so I'm certainly going to ask a bit about that. You know, it's fascinating to hear that story in your own words there, and how, I suppose, experience, built upon experience, led you to where you ended up, where you had that ability to work with big movies and indeed work with a big publishing company like that. I suppose it certainly it's going to inspire some who hear that story and think that, you know, it's, I suppose people maybe think it's impossible to work with these kind of big organizations, but you know, you're definitely proof that it can actually happen.
It starts out with education.
Yeah.
When I was a child, I went to the movies a lot, and I saw, you know, John Wayne movies, and I really liked film, but I also liked music. So in grade school and high school, I concentrated on writing, and I thought a lot about, you know, showbiz, the entertainment industry. Paula also, you know, from a little girl on, she wanted to be a writer, and she, you know, we both got an education. We both studied a lot and learned how to do the things. So that, I mean, in Paula's case, she knew everything she could about Star Trek, and she knew everything she could about the publishing industry, and that was the perfect thing that the executives of Paramount Pictures were looking for when they needed somebody to fill a job. I couldn't think of anybody else at the time that probably could have done the job as Paul did it.
There might have been, but I was in the right place. I was literally in the right place at the right time.
And had the right education for it.
Because I found out about the opening. I immediately applied, and it wasn't the type of job that they could advertise really openly. You know, you can't put an ad in Variety and say, wanted someone who knows a lot about Star Trek, you know.
Right.
But, and in my case, the way that I got involved in the movie studios, I went to the personnel office, I took a typing test, I got hired into their secretarial pool, I went around and introduced myself to people who worked on the lot, and one of them hired me into the office. From the time I took the typing test until the time I had a permanent sit down at a desk job as a lowly assistant was 2 years.
Terry used to do, when he used to go around to conventions, he would promote the movies for the studio he was working for, but he also used to do a little talk on the business of Hollywood. And basically, it was to let the fans know that, you know, people who work in Hollywood aren't gods. They all start somewhere. And he basically said, you know, if you have a skill, you know, location is important. You can't get a job in Hollywood if you don't live in Hollywood. But he said, you know, if you're serious about wanting to get into the entertainment industry, first of all, you sort of have to be there. But your skill can make you don't have to be an actor. You don't have to be a writer. If you're good at electronics, you can get a job in doing lighting and creating things for the movies. If you're good at art, you can do things. If you're good at costuming, I do have friends in Fandom who got into costuming later on, and you know, it's the type of thing that you use your skills. But a lot of people just sit at home and think, gee, I wish I could do that. And you know, the answer to what you asked originally is basically, if you really want to do something, then you have to kind of work towards what you want to do to get there.
Yes.
I keep reverting back to education. If you know how to do something, if you've been making, you know, clothing since you were a little kid, you can get into wardrobe. If you used to build radios, tear apart electronic devices, you know, your mother would get mad at you for taking the toaster apart. There's a job for you in the entertainment business. I mean, there are companies, there are air conditioning companies. That doesn't sound like showbiz, but the only work they do is supplying equipment to film locations. So they're on the set the whole time. Okay, you're not on screen, but you're certainly on the set, and you're certainly in the entertainment business. And you read those, you know, the end credits on movies nowadays will have, you know, 200-300 names of people. Some of them are animal trainers. If you love your dogs, you're into, there's an opportunity. Some of them are helicopter pilots. Some of them work for crane rental companies. everybody's in showbiz. Whatever your particular talents and interests are, you can do it.
Yeah, I mean, Mike Okuda, who was the scenic artist for many, many Star Trek shows, was he?
He started out as a medical illustrator working for a doctor's office.
No, was it that, or was Hawaii. It Aaron?
No, he started out as a medical illustrator working in for a doctor in Hawaii, and he submitted some of ideas to Hollywood.
And he loved Star Trek, so he sent some sketches, Star Trek sketches that he had done to the producers of the Star Trek movies, because that's what was in production at the time. Yeah. It was in the 70s. And eventually, the sketches were so good that somebody with an open mind looked at them, one of the producers, and said, I love your stuff. Maybe when the next movie starts up, we'll talk to you. And he had enough of a professional background in art that they thought seriously about hiring him. So they did actually fly him from Hawaii to Los Angeles to talk to them the next time they started a Star Trek movie. And that was how he got his whole career started in Star Trek.
So whatever your personal talent and interests are, there's a job for you there. I'm not recommending that everybody try to get into Hollywood. I mean, you can, if you're a medical illustrator, perhaps you're better off staying in the medical industry. But think of how happy you would be because you're doing what you want to do for your career.
Now, of course, we are speaking about the way things have been in the last few decades, and things are changing a lot now. So, I mean, if you're really good at computer graphics, anything related to computer, you may have a career ahead of you anyway. Right. We went last night to see a re-release of Lawrence of Arabia, and it's an amazing movie. We wanted to see it one more time on the big screen, and we were looking at it, and parts of it made us really sad because the way that movie was shot will never, ever be done again. They went out into, the desert, and they shot for a year and did all sorts of things. And, you look at some of the beautiful panorama shots they did in there, which are similar to the type of things that the producers who did the classic Westerns did, where they would just set up a camera and you had this beautiful background, and, and they had the camera way high up on a hill, and you saw in the distance people on camels, they look
hundreds of camels,
looking like little tiny dots running by. Yeah. Now, who's going to go to the expense of arranging to rent hundreds of camels these days, with people riding at it and set their camera up in the middle of the Sinai Desert or something like that, and shoot something which is going to be tremendously expensive when you can recreate it in your computer? Nobody's going to go out to the real world anymore. Yes. So, that's a side trip. Well, that's just a conversation about how the industry is changing, and that is affecting Star Trek too.
But on the other hand, you were never able to set up a camera and shoot your spaceship going across the sky. So it's a natural growth within the industry. Keep your eye on the future. Yeah, yeah. I mean, in the book that we just wrote, the TNG 365 book, at one point, producer Brandon Braga kind of was getting nostalgic about the fact, he says, those model ships were so great, and they're just not doing that anymore. They don't really work with physical models anymore. They're 3D models out of the computer. Right. And, there's a difference. They look terrific on screen. Maybe they look even better, but, they'll never be using those ships anymore. It's really sad. You can't set it on your shelf,
Yeah.
I kind of miss the model days where the ship was a model rather than the CGI. Yes. When they kind of switched over to that in Enterprise, I did feel a little bit sad, actually, that there wasn't a model there anymore,
Yes. Well, and also it cost some jobs. There were people who worked for motion control photography companies. Nowadays, there's maybe as many jobs, but people are typing on a computer keyboard, rather than working with actual physical models. Yeah. It's kind of a shame.
Yeah, a lot of the people that we got to know, both in writing the Deep Space Nine companion and, later books, they had to make that transition from model maker and model filmer to someone who could create that all or direct it on computer. People like Dan Curry had to go from, but he was already flexible because he started out as a fine artist.
Yeah.
He did medical illustrations too, but he also did beautiful portraits and things like that. And he was kind of a Renaissance man. So he moved into effects type of production with Star Trek, and he had done a bit of it earlier on some movies too.
It's about education, though. If you know how to do something, learn how to do everything you can possibly learn how to do.
And be flexible, because no matter how well you know something, things are going to change.
Yeah, things change. I mean, if you were a blacksmith and suddenly the automobile was invented, you weren't doing as many horses, but you could maybe work on automobile parts. And that, that translates into today, and that translates into tomorrow.
Are we philosophizing too much?
Yes.
It's very enlightening, because, like I say, there's a lot of people who, as I say, would be wanting to get into the film industry. And again, even coming from this part of the world, it seems like an even greater leap to be able to do that. I suppose in a similar way to the TV series and their open script submission policy, where fans were able to submit scripts. You, of course, were involved with Strange New Worlds, which in a sense was the literature equivalent of that, where fans were submitting stories, and it ended up being, it was a competition really, wasn't it? And you would be a published author as part of that book.
It was. That was kind of John Ordover, one of the editors at Pocket Books at the time. That was kind of his baby, but I had always been encouraging him because I remembered my days doing fanzines. And I said, there's some really good writers out there. It'd be great if we could do something. So he came up with the idea of the contest. And then we also pulled in my brain these days, another editor, and the three of us would it was great fun, just reading through all of these stories and picking, we'd narrow it down. Usually those guys started out, John would read all the entries first, and then he would narrow it down and give it to Dean. Or actually, I think it was the other way around. Dean would start out reading everything, and then he'd give a big pile of the ones he liked best to John, and then John would go through them, and they would end up sending me like 40 stories, and then we'd whittle it down to the 20 stories or whatever that got into each book. But it was a lot of fun. And then we'd pick which one we liked best to give the best award to, and that type of thing.
And some of those authors that were chosen from those fanzines are working as professional writers today.
Yeah, a lot of them are. A lot of them went on to write novels. A couple of them have gone into television writing. Jeffrey Thorne has gone on to writing on Leverage, which is a TV show. I don't know if it's hit Great Britain yet, but it's on television out here. Jonathan Frakes actually directs a lot on that show.
Yeah, I mean, again, I remember reading The Strange New Worlds. I certainly have one or at least two of those books. And again, it must have been such a kind of a great thing to be able to give a fan an opportunity like that, and to, in a sense, make them a published author. I mean, did you ever get any feedback from any of those people? Did you ever meet any of them even?
Yeah, I've met some of them at conventions, and I've talked to, and a lot of them are my friends on Facebook now. I actually have quite a lot of those people as my friends, because they continued writing Star Trek stories and then went on to writing other ones. So, I've got all these friends who are people that, even if I've never met them in person, we've met in writing, which is great.
Exactly.
And I was really proud of Paula when that happened, because coming into Star Trek a little later, I was fascinated by the number of people who were working on their own because they were fans. They were writing these stories, and some of the stories were really, really good. And I kept saying, isn't it a shame? Wouldn't it be nice if some of these could be professionally published? And then one day, suddenly Paula was doing it. It made me very happy.
Brilliant.
Yeah, and it was kind of also a tip of the hat to what Michael Piller did on The Next Generation. He gave so many people their careers by having that open submissions policy, which went all the way through all of the televised Star Trek shows, even after he left the scene. And it was not just a matter of saying, okay, let's let everybody do this, and that's the way it'll be, and it's simple and easy. It was a legal nightmare for the studio.
Right.
They hated that he'd done that because, you know, in Hollywood, everybody claims to have the idea first, and you stole my idea and all that. And this was just like begging for somebody to say, that's my story, you read it, and that must have been my story, you know, without people realizing that, you know, lots of people think about a story about, you know, a landing party going to a planet where a creature comes out of a cave, you know.
I can think of a few, certainly.
You know, but they said, no, that was my idea first. But anyway, it was very bold of Michael Piller to come up with that idea. It was a great idea. And it unearthed some great writers. It gave a lot of people their starts and created some great producers now. I mean, in the book, we talk about the young guns, who were a bunch of 20-something people just out of college who got internships or submitted a script, one or the other, on the show and became big-time, big-name people, you know, like Ron Moore being the most famous of them, which is kind of why we asked him to do the introduction. He just seemed like the quintessential person to do an introduction to a book that was a tribute to the next generation.
Right.
Absolutely, and again to remind people that Star Trek The Next Generation 365 is in bookstores now, and I would certainly recommend to pick it up, and we're going to certainly talk more about it in the coming minutes, and well, we won't keep you for hours anyway, but thank you indeed for staying on with me. Indeed, you know, one of my favourites, and this one is you know, very special to me, being a student of filmmaking, Star Trek Action. I honestly think head and shoulders above all of my Star Trek books, I would put that one as really being my favourite for being so detailed, so insightful. For people who haven't read it, it basically takes you through the creation of 2 Star Trek episodes in a very illustrated and detailed way. When did that actual process begin? Were you just called in for that? Did it get commissioned? Did you have to suggest the idea?
No.
That's one of those things where there's a saying, if you want to get a job done, give it to a really busy person.
Right. Margaret Clark was the nonfiction book editor in the Star Trek division at Simon & Schuster at the time. And I was writing the Deep Space Nine companion.
With me.
with Paula. I mean, but I was living on the set and interviewing people and getting as much material gathered as possible, and it literally was a full-time job. And then one day Margaret called and she said, you know, once a year I like to put out a real special coffee table book, so why don't you put aside the Deep Space Nine companion and real quickly turn out a book. And my idea, she said, Margaret said.
It was her idea.
It was her idea. And she said, I would like to take every single thing that it takes to produce 2 minutes of a television show and a movie. So we discussed it, and we decided to pick a scene and do a 2-minute scene from Deep Space Nine, a 2-minute scene from Voyager, and a 2-minute scene from the movie that was shooting at the time, which happened to be Insurrection. Yeah. Star Trek Insurrection.
And one of the main motivators of the book was the fact that Insurrection was being shot at the time and was going to come out around the time that the book was scheduled to be released. So they knew it would be a good way to promote both the movie and sell the book at the same time.
And Margaret said, you have 90 days to write this book. I thought, how in the world are we going to do that? So I literally went to the set. I had a little tape recorder and a pad and pencil, and I sat and watched every single thing that they did for the scenes they were doing at the time. So the calendar, the Star Trek schedule at the studio actually dictated which scenes we did. And I interviewed as many people as I could. I went to the editing room. I went to the dailies. I went to the writers' offices. I begged people, let me interview you. And of course, a lot of people say, wait, I thought you were doing the Deep Space Nine companion right now. And I say, yes, and this as well. And we got it done.
Well, and ironically, at the same time, now, over in the licensing department, whenever there was a book that was going to be behind the scenes about one of the shows or the movies, we had to get permission from Rick Berman. So and at the same time, Pocket was thinking they wanted to do a behind-the-scenes book just about insurrection, a separate book from this. So we asked Berman if both books could be done, and he thought about it a while because he was one of those people who really didn't like to reveal too much of the magic behind how things were done on the sets. But he finally said yes. And because they said yes at the same time to the two projects, Margaret assigned Terry to both books, you know, with my working with him. He was the guy who got all of the interviews and gathered all that information, and then the two of us would sit at home and write it all up. So, you know.
Right. So
now there was the 90 days to do the action book, and I think
so we were doing, I mean, we're in the middle of doing this, the Deep Space Nine Companion.
Yes.
And all of a sudden we had 90 days to do this, the action book. And then in the middle of that 90 days, all of a sudden we had to do the Star Trek Insurrection book. Right. So it was literally a book within the time frame of another book that was within the time frame of another book, and they all had deadlines.
And they all had to be different. You know, you couldn't just copy the information from one to the other.
It was crazy.
So we had to decide, after the information came home and transcribing all of the interviews, like, okay, we'll use this here and this there, and it was maddening.
It was maddening.
You know, so you know, we did all that. We were shocked when they actually got done on time, and then Margaret calls up and complains that we haven't turned in any stuff on the Deep Space Nine Companion lately. What's wrong with us?
Right.
It was maddening.
It sounds like a lot of pressure, and you know, it just reminds me as well to think that you did have 3 books in a sense on the go, ready to be released and sort of rushed and in a small period of time. It reminds me of how much merchandise, literature, video games, everything there was back maybe in that late 90s era when there were so many shows on the air. You had DS9 finishing and Voyager still with a few seasons to go. You know, I remember there being so much available then. Do you feel it's still the same now that, you know, are there as many reference books out there? It certainly is a pleasure to see this one out because I haven't seen much in the bookstores for a while now.
No, there definitely aren't as many books because, you know, there got to be a little bit of a glut in terms of Star Trek with fandom. And, you know, by the time that Enterprise ended and Nemesis came out, people were they were a little burned out. They still liked Star Trek, but they weren't going to the movies as much, they weren't watching TV as much, and they weren't buying as much merchandise. So stuff kind of faded out a bit, you know, but you know, people always thought, well, it's just lying fallow because people will always come back to things if they really love it. But we have been told this is kind of, this book and the previous 365 book are kind of the first real widespread reference books that have been done for a long time. Yeah. And that's also because publishers, these are expensive books for them to do, and publishers don't want to put money out there unless they think they're going to get a return. Pocketbooks had the exclusive Star Trek license, the Pocketbooks division of Simon & Schuster, for decades. And then finally they realized they just weren't making enough money back on the nonfiction books, the reference type books. And so they completely stopped doing them.
Yeah. There's economic situations. Pocketbooks learned that $29 seemed to be the most you could charge for a behind-the-scenes book and sell enough copies that it was worthwhile actually having done it. Well, you can't publish color photography for that price. Yeah. The biggest complaint we've ever heard about the Deep Space Nine Companion is that all the photography is in black and white.
And that there's no index, which the reason for that was there wasn't enough time to get one done. By the time we finished working on it, there wasn't enough time to do an index.
But the color, it was going to be, the Deep Space Nine Companion was going to be a full color book. And all the photography that we submitted for it were color rather than black and white shots. But when the production department at Simon & Schuster did their budget on it, they discovered that the book would cost $62 a piece to make.
Wow.
So they would have to sold them for $75, where $29 is the maximum that the average fan wants to pay for a book. The only recourse at the time was to just transfer all of that color photography into black and white and put the book out. And it's still a wonderful book, but people said, a lot of people have written and said, oh, it would have been much better in color. Yes, that's true, but you would not have purchased it. So it was a decision that had to be made. When Abrams Books called us about doing the first 365 book, the original series 365, it was one of my concerns. I said, you're doing these big full color coffee table books. And they said, yes, but that's the business that we're in. And they have worked it out somehow that they can manage to do full color books, because that's their intention.
Yeah, because they don't do pocketbooks, as you might guess by the name, was essentially, they made most of their money from releasing small fiction books, what used to be called pocketbooks, and now are mostly, the graphic novel size. But, so their whole budget structure wasn't set up for doing a lot of color unless they were going to sell a lot of copies, which, wasn't possible at the expense. But Abrams is, a company that does mostly color books, and mostly, a lot of coffee table. Most of it is hardcover,
big full color, hardcover.
And they do the wimpy kid books too, but but that's a different thing. But they do a lot of colors, so they have that all worked out in the budget. So, and they also had the 365 series of books established, so they knew how much one of those books cost them to do. They had budgets already in place, and in fact, when they proposed doing these books, they laid out the whole budget, and they said how much they were going to be spending on illustrations and all of that stuff.
Yeah, it's expensive.
Certainly makes a lot of sense to hear you say that there is obviously a whole economic situation around the world, and I suppose that does all affect sales. I just think back to the time when I would have bought the DS9 companion. Around that time I would have picked up another one that I really loved. It was called New Worlds, New Civilizations, I believe. It had sort of art, really just special, with writing and some stories in there as well. Books like that just remind me of an era that I hope at some point, maybe through this next movie, Star Trek Into Darkness, we might see a return to more of the kind of merchandise coming out. Do you think there's, I suppose, any likelihood that perhaps there'll be movie reference books, and maybe you might be involved in something like that in the future?
It's possible. I mean, our editor at Abrams has talked a little bit about the idea of maybe doing a book about the Star Trek movies down the road. Yeah. It always depends on how well the last book sold before they decide what to do.
Yeah, the bottom line actually falls into the hands of the fans and the readers. If enough books move off of the shelf, then there's a reason to publish another one. If enough books don't move off the shelf, there's no reason to publish another one. It's a shame. But the publisher and the fans, the readers, the buyers, are in an absolute symbiotic relationship. Without one, there isn't the other.
Yeah, and in fact, we read the bulletin boards, the Star Trek bulletin boards periodically. We'll look at them and see what people are saying. And, you so frequently will see complaints by them like, well, why aren't there more reference books, and why aren't there blueprints, and why isn't Rick Sternbach doing more, of his graphic books? They were great. And the answer is because not enough people were buying them. And then you say that, and the people say, well, I would buy it, and they don't quite get the mathematics of it, like, yes, you would buy it. Maybe you'd talk 5 of your friends into getting it, but that still wouldn't be enough, But, so it's frustrating for everybody. Yeah. But to answer your other point, the movies have really struck a chord. It was true. Star Trek lying fallow for several years with nothing Star Trek coming out did seem to heighten interest in Star Trek again. And by starting over with a whole new scenario for Star Trek, J.J. Abrams has drawn in a lot of new fans, young people, because, you know, face it, the people who watched the original series when it was originally on are getting pretty old. But, so
what are you saying?
so you know, they needed to bring in that young audience. And Star Wars, you know, when they released their new movies, started drawing in a younger audience into that franchise. And, you know, so the new movies, whatever people think about them, are drawing in a new audience, which is good, you know. So it has a chance to stretch and grow and develop. It's still the basic idea of Star Trek. So, and it actually has been a good shot in the arm for the rest of Star Trek merchandise too. They're still doing things with the original series and the Next Generation and Deep Space Nine because people still love that too. So it's just kind of revitalized the whole merchandising area.
The concept of making of has changed, however. When I first started working on these books, I would go to the lab of the model maker and watch them pouring plastic and making molds and cutting out the pieces and gluing them together. Today, you say to someone, "How did you make that model?" They say, "Oh, I used the program, such and such program in my computer," and they give you some numbers of the programming that they used, and that's the end of it. There's no more to say. So it has, because of the computer programming, it has changed so much. Making of it is almost an uninteresting subject because you can't take pictures of the guy with his razor blade cutting pieces of plastic or stripping pieces of wire or anything like that. It's all click, 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 click. It's a different thing.
Absolutely, and I can tell you, when I read that TNG was celebrating its 25th anniversary, I felt old at that point. I really did. It's just hard to believe it's been that long since the show debuted. I mean, I have the book here in my hand. I suppose to talk a bit more about Next Generation 365, essentially it's an episode guide with a lot more. That's probably how I would explain it. I suppose, what would you say the format is in your own words?
You know that.
Well, we had to include, you have to make any of these books kind of an episode guide just because, you know, here's the story and then what's interesting behind the scenes on it. But
we told it in episode order, obviously. We started out talking a little bit about why did, in fact, Gene Roddenberry and Paramount Pictures together decide to start a new series, the Next Generation, after Star Trek hadn't been in production for a long time other than the movies. So we start out with the origins, the idea, take it through, casting and, wardrobe decisions, all of that, and then followed like an episode guide each episode. But we didn't concentrate on shooting or the actors. We decided, because the actors have been covered so often, and they've been and they're so available at conventions. They're these wonderful people who will come out to the conventions and jump on stage and tell you all of these wonderful stories. We decided to find some stories that hadn't been told. So we went to the people who worked with the actors who have never been on stage at a convention. And that kind of dictated, even though we were telling chronologically and episode by episode through the entire series, we tried to go to people who hadn't been interviewed all that many times.
But who were equally responsible
Absolutely.
For what made episodes so wonderful, because, it's not just the actors that make an episode, it's not just the directors, it's not just the producers, it's everybody, and without any of those components, it wouldn't have been as good an episode. So we tried to tell the stories of everyone. And in a way, part of the reason we did that was because there have been two really, really good behind-the-scenes books on the Next Generation, both of which I read and edited while I was at Paramount, which was Larry Nemechek's The Next Generation Companion, and Judith and Garfield Reeves Stevens' The Continuing Mission. Those are wonderful books, and they have a lot of information about how the show was made. So we're in this terrible position of, how do we say something that people haven't read in those other books? You know, I don't want anybody thinking we're ripping them off. But you know, so we were very respectful of that. So we actually, you know, we would look at their books and say, okay, this is what they covered on that episode. What didn't they talk about? You know, and there is some overlap because you can't avoid that. You know, but we really tried hard to get it to put the spotlight in corners that they didn't get into, not because they didn't want to, but because they were covering so much else. So, you know, and we talked to people, you know, we did talk to some of the actors. We talked to Jonathan Frakes and LeVar Burton, but we talked to them about directing because we thought, okay, well, that hasn't been covered extensively. They've talked about it at conventions, but, you know, so we talked to Jonathan about the whole reason why he got into directing in the first place. And Jonathan was important because, you know, he gave a whole lot of actors their careers just by his gumption in deciding he wanted to direct. And in this whole program being set up to teach these guys how to direct, because they didn't come out of film school. They, you know, they came out of acting, you know, so they had to learn exactly how a director directs and what they have to know. And Jonathan was the first one to go through that because Rick Berman wanted to make sure that he really was serious about this. So he made him go to all these things. He says, you go to the editing bay and you go to the sound people and you
go to the casting office.
And when you know everything that there is about putting together an episode, maybe I'll let you do one. You know, so it took a couple of years before he was able to do it. And he told us that story in there. And now he's a really well-established director. And he did open the door for everybody else, like LeVar. And, you know, I think just about everybody on the show has directed.
Duncan O'Neill.
Yeah, and Roxanne Dawson. You know, they've all got very established careers on, you know, even, you know, producing and directing on shows because of Jonathan.
It's fantastic, of course. As I say, you can see that there's so many photos that you just manage to fit in. Some of the photo pages have two side to side. So it must have been a tricky process, as you talked about earlier, to whittle down everything and to decide. And as you mentioned there, the Next Generation Companion, as I said before here on Trek Speak, alongside the DS9 Companion, really two of the most detailed books for behind the scenes information. And I certainly feel there's a lot of that kind of style of writing here, information, just things that we haven't known about before.
See, it's important to know that we got our information by interviewing people, or even maybe for some other books, but those authors had interviewed those people. And I guess the secret behind that is the interviewees. You know, the actors, whether it be Rick Berman or at the time Gene Roddenberry or Patrick Stewart or Michael Okuda or Dan Curry or any of those people, when we call them up and say we would love to get a half an hour of your time, they always immediately say, "Yep, no problem, let's do it." And either it's in person, sometimes we've been invited to their homes. Sometimes it's in a restaurant, sometimes it's on the telephone, but they're always so cordial, and it never ends up being in half an hour. It'll be an hour or 2 hours, or then let's finish and do another 2 hours tomorrow afternoon. They're all such friendly, nice people that gathering the information turned out to be much easier than one would expect. Everybody wants to share their stories. None of the people working on Star Trek have ever said to me, "No, I'm not interested." It's fascinating to me how nice they all are.
Yeah, it might be a matter of timing because they say, "Gee, I'd really love to, but you know, I mean, Jonathan, we had to wait a couple months to talk to him because he was going off to shoot episodes of Leverage."
Right.
You know?
Same thing with Brandon Braga and Renee Echeverria, two of the writers. They were working on Terra Nova at the time, and literally, Terra Nova was going to premiere like 4 or 5 days later, and Brandon Braga gave us 3 hours one late one evening, because even though he was still in the editing room, they were working on publicity. he wanted to be involved in this book, and he literally stepped away from Terra Nova long enough to give us 3 hours of his time.
I know, and he thanked us for calling him because, you know, no matter how far away from Star Trek these guys have gotten, it's where they started, and you know, just about everybody associated with the show. It was such a successful show. Everybody has fond memories of it. You know, and they all like to reflect on the past. You know? They enjoyed getting into these reflections that they hadn't thought about for years.
I think a lot of the people that we spoke with here, they've all had big, you know, very successful careers, but I do believe that it's true. Star Trek is their favorite memory. Star Trek is their favorite show they worked on. They relish the fact that they worked with Star Trek. So they're willing to share their stories with us.
Excellent. Of course, as I say, people should certainly pick this one up. And indeed, the original series 365 as well, which I certainly have to put over, has been a fantastic read. And of course, they are now both available. So as I say, you can get them in bookstores or indeed via Amazon.com. Just briefly on that point, I wanted to ask you as well, being in the business, I suppose, what is your take on the changeover now from the hard copy to the digital format? Are you in support of that? Do you think it's a good thing for the industry?
Well, it is what happens. I mean, we're kind of sad about it because, you know, we grew up with books. Everybody grew up with books, right? With paper books, except for the current young generation. And it makes us sad to think, you know, that maybe paper won't be around anymore. But, you know, technology advances all the time. You know, horse and buggy changed to automobile, and you know, we don't have flying cars yet, but maybe someday.
Maybe we will. It's the same way. I told you I came out of, you know, started my career in the music industry. I still miss the 45 record. Right. I liked putting that little round plastic piece in the middle of a big hole in the 45 and putting it on the turntable and dropping the needle. I miss that a lot. Last night we went to see a movie,
Lawrence of Arabia,
and yeah, we went to see Lawrence of Arabia, as we said. And when the movie started, suddenly I had a flashback that when we first saw that film, the curtain opened and closed across the front of the screen as the logo from the releasing company came up, and all of a sudden, I got real nostalgic. I miss the curtain, but they haven't had curtains on movie screens for several decades now. Things change.
With certain things, I saw an interview recently with Gina Centrello, who's a publisher at one of the big houses. She used to be in charge of the Star Trek book line as well as other things at Simon & Schuster, and she said, they asked her, do you think that print books are going to be replaced totally by digital? And she said, I don't think so. I don't think it'll ever be completely replaced. And she just didn't believe it because she said digital has made things really easy, especially in fiction, because people like to grab it and take it with them. She didn't think that would happen so much with picture books because it's a little harder. One thing that's interesting is these 365 books, Abrams decided to release this one digitally as well as in print. Now, most people will buy the print, but it is also available on Amazon as a Kindle, and it is available at Barnes & Noble for the Nook, and it's also available in several other platforms. They're making it available in all platforms for digital. And I didn't ask them if they have done that for other coffee table books before, but I would think this might be one of the first.
Right.
And I'm kind of curious about that. It's on sale now at the Kindle store, so I don't have a tablet yet, but I'm thinking of downloading it anyway. It'll be kind of hard to see on my iPhone, but I want to see what it looks like because now you wouldn't think that would be too good for a regular coffee table book. But this one, because of the horizontal aspect of the book, I think it might work pretty well on a tablet.
Perfect, in fact. And, you know, I would be very fascinated to see it as well. As you mentioned there, possibly the first book of this type in that digital format. It's fascinating to hear that.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't know. There may have been other ones. I know for sure there haven't been any Star Trek books in that format, coffee table books like that. So it is the first of those. But I'm kind of curious about what people will think of it. I floated the question on one of the Trek bulletin boards just to see what people thought, and a lot of people were aghast. They said, "Oh, that's a terrible idea, awful. You know, how can you look at these great pictures?" And I thought, well, you know, as I said, at least with this book, where on a tablet you turn it sideways and you can see the whole picture. You don't have to kind of move it around to get it the right size or anything. I think it works pretty well for this type of book, but not too many books are this type of setup, though. You know, where they're largely horizontal rather than vertical.
Absolutely ideal. At that point, I must say thank you so much for coming on and having a chat with me today on video Skype. And again, to let people know, it's Star Trek The Next Generation 365, available now, and I can thoroughly recommend it. We're hopefully going to show some imagery from the book as well throughout this video. So indeed, have a look and indeed check it out. Get that digital version. And indeed, I think, as you said there, it suits the Kindle perfectly with that horizontal format as well. So again, thank you so much. It's been fantastic, Paula and Terry. Indeed, maybe we'll speak to you again at some point in the future.
Yes. I hope so.
And thank you for allowing us to ramble.
Yes, and thank you for introducing us to Skype.
It's a pleasure. I'm sure you'll find some use for it in the future, definitely. I'd say if any podcasts or anything like that were contacting you, you could almost suggest Skype, you know, because it certainly worked very well here tonight.
Well, when I was a child, you know, all those hundreds of years ago, there used to be rumors that someday there would be something called the video phone. Well, here it is.
I know. I feel like I'm in 2001, where that guy called his daughter.
It took my lifetime for it to happen, but it's finally here.